Okay, hello everyone. This is going to be a video of me writing one of your semester exam essays. Specifically, I'm going to be writing in this video a response to the prompt, assess the effectiveness of judicial review as a mechanism for promoting individual rights of vulnerable groups and/or democratic institutions. I came up with these prompts myself, so forgive the the writing because I was under a time crunch of the prompts. They may be a little bit more difficult than they need to be, or the wording may be a little bit awkward. But I definitely do think that these prompts will allow you to engage with a lot of the topics and major topics and themes of this course, and will allow you to think deeply about how some of the foundational documents and core concepts of this course can link together. Having said that, I'm running a tight schedule because I plan on writing at least 2 of these essays that I included in your semester exam review packet, and then potentially a third essay for prompt 3, but I'm a little bit iffy on that. And also a couple of essays for my AP European History class that I'm also teaching at the same time. So I might get these videos rolled out slowly, but I'm going to try to get a response to this prompt done and a response to the second prompt also done by today. So the first thing I want to do is I want to copy and paste this prompt and put it at the end of the review. And so I had discussed how I had created this lengthy review to really kind of this lengthy reference sheet that you can use with all sorts of concepts, rulings, amendments that you should please make use of it and make use of it as you're writing. When you're actually writing your essay, I want you to think of it not only in terms as practicing the writing skills that you're going to need to be successful on the AP Government exam, but also reviewing a lot of the core concepts and content. And if you're watching this video, take notes of my explanations of all of these major pieces of evidence because you, in theory, need to know all of them, right? And so without further ado, I'm going to get into it. The prompt is assess the effectiveness of judicial review. We've talked about judicial review a lot, and we talked about it being a peculiar and unique feature of the American legal system as a mechanism for protecting individual rights of vulnerable groups and/or democratic institutions. That and/or allows someone to engage in a broad discussion. They can talk about judicial review as the mechanism for protecting vulnerable groups. So when we're thinking about vulnerable groups, we're thinking about people that historically have been subjected to either racial discrimination or some form of disenfranchisement. So we're thinking of people of color, people in the LGBTQ community, stuff like that. When we're thinking of democratic institutions, we're thinking about, at its base, institutions and practices that are counter to the authoritarian practices that we discussed at length in Unit 2. So what I mean authoritarian practices, remember we had discussed authoritarianism at length in Unit 2. Particularly, we kind of linked it to this increasing trend in the accretion of executive power, which incidentally is an essay prompt that you can choose to write. It's the second essay prompt that you can choose to write. It's the second essay prompt that you can choose to write, sorry. But for the purposes of this essay, we're just going to focus on judicial review as a mechanism for protecting the individual rights of vulnerable groups, so protecting individual rights of people that have historically faced racial discrimination, all sorts of stuff. And so I tell you that you can use 4 pieces of evidence from the following list. And remember to definitely use the reference sheet to help you, refresh your memory about what Federalist 51, for instance, says. What does Federalist 78 say? What does Federalist 70 say? What's the 14th Amendment? All those good sorts of stuff, right? That's why I included such a long list of pieces of evidence, and I asked you to choose 4 pieces of evidence from the list. So Federalist 51, I don't know if you remember, but Federalist 51 talks about ambition counteracting ambition. There's the famous From line. I think From was probably one of the most controversial articles that a lot of you read, that was very critical of President Trump, and it was written in January 2017, where he has this kind of famous line about ambition counteracting ambition, and he talks about Federalist 51, but then he says that political partisanship and political polarization have kind of rendered moot this idea of checks and balances and separation of powers and political parties. If there's a unified sort of government, there is nothing to stop the, an authoritarian executive from getting what they want. And he kind of offers a foreboding warning. Some of us agreed with his position, some of us disagreed with his position. But at the core, Federalist 51 is very much about checks and balances, and the importance of separation of powers and having overlapping branches of government that to exert their power, they need approval of other branches of government. So we talked about separation of powers as being kind of a structure, and but overlapping, like these different branches of governments have overlapping responsibilities that forces this sort of constant tension. And the rationale behind this constitutional mechanism was ambition would be made to counteract ambition. It would prevent tyranny. We also talked about Federalist 78, but not very long. I want to specifically go to the reference sheet to look at some of the quotes that I included for Federalist 78, which we can see up here. So Federalist 78, here are some of the quotes. It talks about the judiciary. It talks about, specifically, it says, the judiciary will always be the least dangerous to the political rights of the Constitution because of the least incapacity to annoy or injure them, since it has no influence of either the sword or the purse. The sword being a reference to the executive branch and the purse being a reference to the legislative branch. Then it goes on, it says no legislative act contrary to the Constitution can be valid. To deny this would be to affirm that the deputy is greater than his principal, that the servant is above his master. The representatives of the people are superior to the people themselves. A constitution is fact and must be regarded by the judges as fundamental law. It therefore belongs to them to ascertain its meaning, as well as the meaning of any particular act proceeding from the legislative body. So basically saying that the judiciary has an important role in according to Federalist 78, the judiciary has an important role for checking the actions of the other branches of governments and ensuring that they're compatible with the higher law of the Constitution. We have discussed at length how peculiar our system is and how the Constitution is kind of like a form of higher law. And although in our system, we often like to think that our Congress in our system passes laws with the power of judicial review. We talked about Marbury versus Madison and all that good stuff. With the power of judicial review, the courts can effectively say that a legislative act or an executive act is unconstitutional and therefore, void. So it's a very important power. The only way to overturn a Supreme Court decision is, of course, to create a constitutional amendment that says a particular course of action is in fact not unconstitutional. But functionally, that is not realistic in our current system. And so, therefore, for all intents and purposes, the courts have, especially the Supreme Court, sort of has the last say on legal issues. on pressing legal issues. Then Federal 78 continues and says the independence of the judges may be an essential safeguard against the effects of an occasional ill humors in the society. These sometimes extend no farther than them to the injury of the private rights of particular classes of citizens by unjust and partial law, that inflexible and uniform adherence to the rights of the Constitution of individuals, which we perceive to be indispensable in the courts of justice, can certainly not be expected from judges who hold their offices by a temporary commission. So it's basically saying, too, that courts have a role, according to Federal 78, in ensuring and preserving individual rights, all that good stuff, and also articulates that there should be an effort underway to shield from the judiciary from political whims, and that has become in our system life tenure of federal judges to shield them from political whims, to allow them to be impartial arbiters and to determine the constitutionality of particular executive and legislative acts. And according to Federal 78, they're supposed to be able to protect the rights of private citizens. So there's a lot of elements here that you could potentially use. Federal 78 talks about the importance of judicial review is generally important for preserving individual rights. Judiciary can be insulated from political whims / fads with life tenure, that it's supposedly the least dangerous of the branches. You can include so many different elements conceivably in your essay about the effectiveness of judicial review. Article 1. So I forgot to put Article 1 of the Constitution. But really, you can look at so many different mechanisms of Article 1 of the Constitution. So we can go here. We can look at the specific enumerated powers of the legislature. But when I'm thinking specifically with Article 1 of the Constitution, I'm thinking of, let's think of a major legislative act. Let's think of something that was passed by the legislature that is this important piece of legislation that really does a great job of preserving the individual rights of vulnerable groups or individual rights of groups. And so one piece of legislation that might come to mind is the Voting Rights Act. You can also put the of 1965. You can also put the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Anything, a piece of legislation specifically, and then you're probably going to have to define the Voting Rights Act. So when you see something like Article 1 of the Constitution, you might say that Article 1 of the Constitution, gives Congress the power to make laws, delegates the legislative authority in a bicameral legislature. The Voting Rights Act was a major piece of legislation. So if there's something like that is very broad, like Article 1 of the Constitution, you can go and find a specific clause of the Constitution, or you can just cite, the general function of Congress, which is the ability to make law and a major piece of legislation. It's really up to you. But you can see how I can potentially use this if I'm going a different route in saying that judicial review is not an effective mechanism for protecting individual rights. Rather, it's Congress or the executive branch. Article 3 is the provision of the Constitution. It's very short. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and such inferior courts as Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. And then it describes original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, and then not much else. So I'm probably not going to use Article 3. Judicial activism versus judicial restraint. Judicial activism is, let me see if I can find a good definition here. Judicial activism is all about using power to further judicial power to further justice. The 14th Amendment, we've talked a lot about the 14th Amendment, specifically the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. We also talked about the ways in which all persons born in the United States. So you can, we also talked about the ways in which different courts have interpreted the 14th Amendment and the guarantees enshrined in the 14th Amendment and all that good stuff. And so all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdictions thereof are citizens of the United States and the states within the territories they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law that would shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. No, to deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. We talked about the importance of the Due Process Clause and substantive due process when we talked a lot about the right to privacy and abortion access and gay marriage. We also talked about the importance of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment specifically, but the courts have over time define the scope of the 14th Amendment differently, right? So you can, depending on how cynical you want to be in this essay, or not necessarily how cynical, depending on your argument, you can talk about maybe Plessy versus Ferguson, which said that racial segregation was not violative of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. Or you can talk, of course, about Brown versus Board of Education, which overturns the Plessy Ferguson decision, and the Warren Court actually determines that the separate but equal doctrine enshrined overturns a separate but equal doctrine and says that separate racial segregation is inherently unequal in Brown versus Board of Education. So again, holding up racial segregation or determining racial segregation is violative of the Equal Protection Clause in Brown versus Board of Education. You could also talk about Korematsu versus the United States, where the Supreme Court ruled that Roosevelt's internment of Japanese Americans was actually constitutional, as evidence, again, of the Supreme Court failing to protect individual rights of vulnerable groups and or democratic institutions. We'll just stick to failing to protect individual rights of vulnerable groups. And then we also watched a lengthy lecture in Unit 5 from a Yale University public lecture series called the Devane Lectures that talked about this important Supreme Court decision, Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, in which the SCOTUS ruled in 2010 based on the assumption that money is free speech, that corporate expenditures in political campaigns could not be limited. The Supreme Court had ruled previously that contributions to political campaigns could not exceed more than $2,700, but corporate expenditures in political campaigns could not be or political elections, I should say, could not be limited. So meaning we talked about how this gives rise to super PACs or super political action committees, which in theory are not supposed to coordinate with political campaigns, but oftentimes they often do, with very weak enforcement of the law by the Federal Election Commission. These super PACs and corporations can spend unlimited amounts of money in these super PACs, and Citizens United really kind of paves the way for it was actually a landmark case in a series of cases. In the lecture, it talked about Buckley versus Vallejo and different Supreme Court cases that really kind of expands the ability for people to spend increasing contributions in political elections. So this would be more damaging to democratic institutions, giving rise to a general cynicism that has existed in American politics that elections are bought. So Mr. Diaz went through all of those. I hate talking about myself in the third person, but I did. I went through all of those, and I have to choose 4, right, to kind of build an argument. And so one of the things that I want you to do beforehand, and I should say this, is actually watch up to at least, I would say, 27 minutes. We had watched the rest on campaign finance of this lecture, Money in Politics, where he talks about this mechanism of judicial review. And hint, hint, he doesn't, Ian Shapiro, the professor in this, doesn't have a very, doesn't think that judicial review is, important for protecting the rights of vulnerable groups or protecting democratic institutions substantially. He's, talks about other countries and societies that adopt judicial review into their constitutions and don't really see, any enhanced protection of individual rights or democratic institutions. You can also cite this lecture. I'll copy and paste and put a bibliography that you can definitely use. But if you're going to use this lecture, go ahead and just put, make sure that you cite or talk about in, let's see, what would be good? Or you can talk about Ian Shapiro says blank, right? And adopt that, and then when you're going to cite it, what would you need to cite? I'll look for the specific citation after the video, and I'll let you guys know in class, because I want to make sure I'm getting the right sort of citation. But you can also cite, what he says in this video, but make sure that you're giving specific attribution to original ideas, because that's super important. Okay. So now I'm going to go ahead and start writing this essay. You can write this essay in several different forms. You can focus predominantly on democratic institutions if you want. And if you're going to focus on democratic institutions, given the evidence here, you would probably need to focus a lot on campaign finance. There's a lot of people that feel that the lax campaign finance laws in the United States, really kind of contributes to the, a corruption of democratic politics. Kind of cynicism that emerges in democratic politics that gives rise to populist uprisings, and you can talk a lot about that at length. If you're going to go the individual rights route, you want to talk about, really hit on, Brown versus Board of Education or Korematsu versus United States, depending on what argument you're advancing. I will say that Ian Shapiro in the video does talk about how the Warren Court is an aberration in the sense of being a court that really does a good job at protecting individual rights and has a court that is an engine for social change. Critics would deride as judicially activist probably at the time, but now in today's age, I think, people really, really do like the decisions of the Warren Court intuitively, such as Brown versus Board of Education, Gideon versus Wainwright, which expanded the rights of the accused, all those good court decisions. But I'm going to go ahead and adopt Ian Shapiro's argument. And every time you have something that says assess the effectiveness, you want to give some sense of how effective you think it is. Is it significantly effective, not very effective, very effective? You can't really just say effective or not effective. You kind of have to add a little bit of an adjective to that. So I'm going to start, just be direct. judicial review is not mechanism for protecting judicial review is not a very effective mechanism for protecting individual rights of vulnerable groups. We can also start, remember, Ms. Smith talks a lot about although and yet and while statements. You can also start by integrating your counter argument. And remember, you're going to have a counter argument by the end of this video at the beginning, and then talking more about it towards the end. So maybe something along the lines of, although you can point out the Warren Court specifically, although the Warren Court decision although decisions of the Warren Court, such as are widely seen as important decisions although the decisions of the Warren Court, such as Brown versus Board of Education and Gator, are widely seen as important enhance protections of vulnerable groups that expanded, forgive the writing, I am tired as heck. Because I don't give a kind of sense of why I don't think judicial review is a very effective mechanism for protecting individual rights of vulnerable groups. So I want to give it a kind of a sense. And so one of the things I will say is judicial review is not, which kind of picks up on the thread, right? I don't actually have to rewrite the thing, right? You don't want to be repetitive, so I'm not going to be repetitive, but I'm going to say historically, the Warren Court was an aberration. Courts more tended to historically, the Warren Court was an aberration. Courts, more often in American history, reinforce. You can talk about racial hierarchies or courts, more often in American history, tend to reinforce racial hierarchies or provide broad deference often in American history tend to reinforce racial hierarchy. You can make that a theme, right? So I was trying to get ahead of myself, but you could make that a theme. Historically, the Warren Court was an aberration. Courts more often in American history tend to reinforce racial hierarchies, as was the case You could also go the angle of also talking about democratic institutions and talk about campaign finance recently. Courts have also been a principal driver in exorbitant by the wealthy seeking to preserve their interests. Right, so this goes more at the democratic angle, which is beyond the purview, or not beyond the purview of the prompt. You can, I give you a suggestion, I would be most impressed if you were to talk about individual rights and the failure of judicial review to really kind of, provide a substantive protection in as you articulated, of individual rights, or maybe when you're evaluating the effectiveness of judicial review as a mechanism, you really have to consider what are the other mechanisms, right? And so when thinking about this, it's helpful to think about, well, what are the other ways in which racial integration might have been achieved? So at the federal level, or what are the other ways in which gay marriage might have been achieved? And so really, that requires thinking about, legislation, right? That requires thinking that these sorts of things would have to be arrived to in the legislature, right, by representatives of the people. And so that's the alternative, right, to judicial review as a sort of mechanism of protecting individual rights of vulnerable groups. There's almost a sense that judicial review is kind of a mechanism that can be used by judicially activist judges that have this sense of principle and feel that there may be certain actions by the executive or the legislative that violated their core principles. And you can also bleed that into your essay if you so desire. But there are really kind of two threads that I take. I talk about, how historically the Warren Court was an aberration. In the video, we can talk about this later, but a lot of the Supreme Court decisions that we memorize that we find so critical for understanding the protection of individual rights, particularly of vulnerable groups, really took place in the Warren Court. We saw a lot of decisions that we studied that disappointed us, like in Schenck versus United States, which we saw as kind of an affront to free speech as we know it today, which of course, gets redefined by Warren Court decisions. So really, what's interesting about the Warren Court is the extent to which we like a lot of these decisions that have since become central and integral to case law today, and our understanding of our rights today. But it allows us to kind of forget that the broad historical trajectory of the United States courts has been one of not trying to rock the boat so much, so to speak, not being an engine of social change. And so this judicial review mechanism, as being effective at preserving and protecting individual rights, well, it seems as such, maybe in the Warren Court, but not so maybe in the Burger Court or the Rehnquist Court, which kind of after the Warren Court, or certainly not so before in previous courts, and maybe not so in the Roberts Court, which, as we talked about last week in Shelby County versus Holder, really invalidates a key portion of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Right, so this is a pretty long thesis. We don't need to include this element of the thesis, but you can if you so desire, right? If you want to be extra, right? So that's just if you want to be extra, but right now I'm just going to focus on individual rights. Then you're going to focus on 4 pieces of elements or 4 pieces of evidence. I'm going to try to choose them right now. I'll choose Federalist 78, maybe Article 1. Talk about the 14th Amendment. I'll talk about these 2 decisions as well. Federalist 78 I'll probably use in my refutation part, and I'll kind of use it as evidence as a kind of although, right? Because Federalist 78 really kind of suggests that judicial review will be an important mechanism for preserving individual rights. So let me see, where should I start? Maybe we'll start with the 14th Amendment. According to, I think this was the phrasing that Ian Shapiro leaves, and then I'll leave room for the citation. I'll tell you what the citation needs to be later on. According to Ian Shapiro, you can leave room for the citation at the end, or the Warren Court is an outlier, and courts have historically tried not to rock the boat. And then you could put and elaborate about this, although a lot in the present day, SCOTUS decisions versus Board of Education suggests that the SCOTUS as an institution can be an important mechanism or important means for preserving or expanding the rights of vulnerable groups. Although SCOTUS decisions in Brown versus Brown versus Support suggests that the SCOTUS is an institution important means for preserving and expanding the rights of vulnerable groups, the judicial review most odious and seemingly violative of the core principles the most odious, or judicial review also been used to affirm the most odious or the constitutionality of the most odious actions of the executive and legislative branches. And so you want to get specific right here and say specifically in Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court determined that the Reconstruction no state can make any laws specifically in Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court determined that the 14th Amendment that said no state did not prohibit racial segregation. Right. And so remember that the piece of evidence that was listed here was the 14th Amendment, right? But I'm already essentially, I'm going to go ahead and highlight yellow. I'm describing what the 14th Amendment says. So here in blue, I'm going to put the descriptions. And then in yellow, I'm going to put the explanation of how it ties back to the thesis. Remember, because in evidence that you use, you want to use the strategy name, describe, and explain. But it's not always that neat where you have to do it in the same order, right? And so I'm going to explain a little bit more and try to connect it back to the thesis again. So specifically in Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court determined that the 14th Amendment that said no state can make laws that denied any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection laws did not prohibit racial segregation. Effectively, the court's interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause gave a green light to racial segregation that to be right. And so this is an instance in which the court again has this kind of heinous opinion, and this, kind of comes down on this, constitutional question of whether racial segregation is constitutional or not, whether it violates the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution, or the 14th Amendment, which it seems to violate at least the spirit of the 14th Amendment, and the Supreme Court says no, right? Which, doesn't get overturned until 1954 in Brown versus Board of Education, and there's all sorts of backlash. But it kind of suggests that the Supreme Court is, as much as we would like to think that, as Federalist 78 says, or I guess not as Federalist 78 says, but that these people would, kind of be in a position to sort of protect individual rights. They would be inoculated to some extent from the political desires of and mob rule and all sorts of stuff. It seems that racism did play a role in the decision of the court itself. But you need not come up with another paragraph to use Korematsu versus the United States or Brown versus Board of Education. So I'll use in addition, in Korematsu versus the United States, the Supreme Court determined that Roosevelt's internment of Japanese Americans was constitutional. All right, that's a good description of the piece of evidence itself. Again, description I'll highlight in blue. But now we want to explain how this gets at our thesis, right? And so you could just put, this is yet another example of the court failing to protect the rights of vulnerable groups against apparent executive overreach or unconstitutional executive overreach, anything you want. So that's sort of another explanation. You can also use evidence to kind of build a counter argument. So again, you could, Brown versus Board of Education would kind of be used in a counter argument. And you could put something along the lines of, although Brown versus Board of Education would strike down the separate would rule or would hold that racial segregation is inherently unequal and therefore violative of the 14th Amendment, the composition of the court that made this landmark and no doubt important ruling would inevitably change. You can also put, in fact, the Nixon administration capitalized on the Warren Court's most on a sense in the American public that the Warren Court had overstepped its bounds and had become judicial activists and even illegitimate. You can get more specific and say Nixon campaigned on a law and order platform, which we discussed, which we saw in the documentary 13th, was a response to a very real boom in crime rates, but also, kind of a racial dog whistle, and in some sense, kind of a reference to a lot of people's feelings that the Warren Court was contributing to a sort of lawlessness that it that was slowly consuming American society. And then Nixon would change the composition of the courts, would go on to change the composition. All this stuff is extra stuff, right? That I'm just adding to give you sort of more information, but I'm not really showing like what are the other 4 pieces of evidence Mr. Thesis is going to use. Would go on to change the composition of the courts from the engine of social change of the Warren Court to the Burger Court. And then actually I can bring a link into like campaign finance law and talk about the Burger Court would hold in Buckley versus let's go on to start a trend would dramatically reduce restrictions on expenditure on contributions and expenditures in political elections, which poses an important threat to American democratic institutions today. Specifically, in Citizens United, a SCOTUS ruling that depended, remember stare decisis, on the Burger Court's decision in Buckley versus Vallejo, the court ruled that since money with the assumption that money was speech, that there could be no limits on corporate political expenditures. this has caused an explosion in the rise of super PACs and legitimate critiques of an American electoral system where the wealthy and powerful have undue influence. Right, so you can go that thread, right, and talk about individual rights here, and then talk about, you know, this kind of, you know, Citizens United decision. You can see that I often describe, and I even give the backstory, which would be very impressive to the AP graders. It'd also be very impressive to Mr. Diaz, because I created this paper itself, right? So giving me sort of the backstory would be very cool. But also sticking with, you know, kind of using the other bits of evidence as well. Now I'm going to go ahead, because we've used Brown versus Board of Education, Korematsu versus the United States. We also use the 14th Amendment too. I want to go ahead and start my refutation. For your refutation, you can also use a piece of evidence in your refutation, and say something like, you know, that although, or that yet, or that while statement that Ms. Smith often talks about. Although Federalist 78 alludes to the importance of the judiciary at protecting individual rights and being insulated by virtue of life tenure from the political whims of society, courts will bend to long-standing pathologies, meaning like sicknesses, such as racism, and will have a history of broad deference at the expense of individual rights. And you can actually talk about other cases too, about the Supreme Court ruling. Actually, in Hamdan versus Rumfield, that would be a case of the Supreme Court kind of in this very important national security law case that I can definitely include in the description, but we actually haven't studied. But in Hamdan versus Rumfield, the Supreme Court actually, you know, kind of deals a blow to the Bush administration's arguments, or a lot of the different things that comes up in the Bush administration's, a lot of different, you know, assertions of executive power that arises in the Bush administration and the war on terror. And what makes that such an important case is that usually the Supreme Court gives so much deference to the executive branch with respect to national security. So it was, again, an outlier too, right? Like using that case to kind of buttress your argument about, you know, the effectiveness of judicial review as a mechanism for protecting individual rights, you know, could work. That's a good piece of evidence. But if it's an outlier too, then it's an outlier. Although Federalist 78 alludes to the importance of the judiciary, courts still bend to long-standing pathologies such as racism and have a history of broad deference to the alleged national security expertise of the executive. Korimatsu. You can be very informal, such as racism, and then you can talk about the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. You can be very informal in your writing because remember that these are timed. So you can be pretty informal in these sorts of essays. But this would be a good example. So I use 4 pieces of evidence here. I actually use more pieces of evidence. I actually go and talk about democratic institutions. I don't have to talk about democratic institutions and how the court or how judicial review in the thesis that I argue here isn't an important mechanism for preserving, democratic institutions, and also for preserving the rights of vulnerable groups. So cool, I'm done.